Welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Friday, November 29th, Black Friday 2024, and I'm very happy to be joined once again by fellow South Stands contributor Paige Van Horn from Denver. PVH, how's it going, my friend?
It's going well, buddy. Happy Thanksgiving. I think this might be TSS first, where we're recording in the AM rather than the PM. So
yeah,
got myself a nice little latte here instead of my standard Heineken. So we'll see how she goes.
All right, my friend. And shout out to our good friend, Chad Plummer. He is with friends and family in the Chicago area. He's unable to join us today.
Chicago.
But we will share Chad's score prediction and concernometer readout at the end of the pod. PVH, we are less than 24 hours away from the 120th renewal of the game. We will get into that matchup momentarily. But before we do, I want to get your thoughts on last week's performance. Ohio State's big win over number 5 Indiana in the Horseshoe. This was a 38-15 victory for the Buckeyes. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on that matchup before we dive into Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about just a second ago, right? It seems like that was 3 months ago, right? Especially with the Michigan game being 24 hours away. But, you know, just listening to your recap pod, I thought 100% agree, right? Like it was a workmanlike, game for us. I think, maybe we played at, I don't know, 65%, 75%.
Yeah.
And, I think, I was really concerned. I was completely wrong on my score prediction, but yeah, I was impressed by Indiana. I mean, I think they're pretty good.
Yeah.
I just think we're simply better, right? Yeah. I mean,
how would you score that without thinking about the final score? What grade would you give Ohio State? Because if you remember on the postgame pod, I said I didn't think they played particularly well, right? I mean, you had season high in penalties. You had 2 red zone turnovers. You didn't run the ball very well. What grade would you give to them without even thinking about the score?
Yeah, C plus. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I'm right there. B minus, maybe.
Yeah, and but that's the defense on the other hand was lights out.
Lights out.
Take away that first drive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, man, they were amazing, and they got pressure. They were disruptive. Special teams, I mean, how much of that is, the other team just making mistakes, but it's a part of the game. So special teams gets an A. I think.
I agree.
It'd be hard to give the defense anything than like a B plus, but offensively we were just sort of ho-hum. So yeah, landing around the C area, I guess, C plus.
I agree. Yeah, I just considering the penalties. I mean, Davison Igbinosun, 3 more pass interference penalties. Oh, I should correct something. He's actually the most penalized defensive player in the country, not overall. Apparently, I was listening to Bill Landis say there's like 2 offensive linemen at some smaller FBS school that actually lead the FBS in penalties. But Igbinosun is far and away the most penalized defensive player in the country. It's crazy.
Well, and didn't he get 2 on the first drive?
2 on the first drive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't think we started the game particularly well because, Ohio State got the ball to start. And on that third down play, Will Howard made a bad read. He had Travion Henderson in the flat wide open for what would have been 25, 30 yards. Instead, he throws 2 yards short of the sticks. And then you had the 70-yard scoring drive by Indiana on the very next possession, aided by 2 PI penalties on Igbinosun. So the game didn't get off to a great start. A lot of penalties, a couple red zone turnovers, as we've mentioned. But the Buckeyes still run away with it anyway. What else stood out to you about that game, PBH?
I think, and it's an interesting sort of narrative, and I can't remember where I read this or listened to it, but I mean, Knowles, his slow starts on defense, especially like these last few weeks, it almost feels like it's deliberate. Yeah. Right? Like he's almost baiting you into doing things. He's trying to, see things because I mean, come on. I mean, they just completely shut them down after that first drive. And the last drive, whatever, I mean, they kind of went down the field, but it was garbage time. And, and it didn't really seem like Indiana was trying to, get back in the game. They were probably just trying to keep it close, for the score. And But I hadn't really thought of that, and there might be something to that because, or at the very least, that guy's making fantastic adjustments. And in college football, right, like that's half the battle, right? Is who's going to adjust to what the other team's trying to do to them? And kudos to Knowles, man. I mean, aren't they the number one ranked total defense in the country?
They are. Yes.
Yeah. So, like, how can you complain about that at this point? I mean, we used to be on this thing saying, Jesus Christ, just be top 25. I mean, there's no reason, that you should ever be less than that with the talent that you have at Ohio State. And now he's got them as the number one total ranked defense. So that to me was the big thing that stuck out, just the pressure. It was good to see Ibuka get back into it.
Yeah, you called that. Nice call, by the way, on that.
And I just think, man, God, good luck now with Tate is humming. And Smith has been quiet these last few weeks, and he's just lurking in the background. So I don't know if you're an opposing defensive coordinator, how you try and game plan for those three guys, with all the other weapons that we have at our disposal. But to see Ibuka being a more of a focal point, I thought was big. Because especially going into a game like Michigan, I think those are the types of players that can make big differences.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wonder if Smith, that sore ankle of Smith's from the end of the Northwestern game, right? He had the long pass reception when the defensive player, the safety, twisted his ankle. He left the game limping, had to get extra tape. And I wonder if maybe he's bothered just a little bit by the ankle. 3 receptions for 34 yards. He did have 1 rush for 12 yards. But, it wasn't a super explosive day from the receivers. But I said on the postgame pod, when the offense needed them to make a play, they did it every single time.
Totally.
And we're still waiting for a perfect, output from this Ohio State offense. It feels like we haven't yet seen an A+ performance from this offense. They're still ascending, and hopefully, we're going to see more than one A+ performance here in the postseason.
I agree. At some level, you're like, I don't even know that they've come close to their ceiling.
I agree. I mean, it feels like this team is still ascending, which is exactly what you want in November. One thing about Knowles that you mentioned, you're right. It seems like he's finally found, after 3 seasons, the perfect balance of pressuring the quarterback, right? Knowing when to pressure the quarterback and knowing when to lay back in a zone or being less aggressive, not exposing his defense to big plays. He's finally found that. I think what's really helped is he's found a real weapon from the second level as a blitzer with Cody Simon.
Yeah.
Because remember we were talking about this a few weeks ago. After the Oregon game, we were like, it doesn't seem like they have anybody that's any good at getting pressure from the second level. They'd all just kind of slam into an offensive lineman or a running back. But Simon has become a real weapon. Ohio State's been very targeted with their pressures. They've timed them perfectly. And I think Jim Knowles, I heard Bill Landis say earlier this week, he's on a heater right now since Oregon. So, and there will be opportunities against Michigan to create the same level of havoc, I think.
Yeah, and one thing I kind of noticed in earlier games is like he would maybe blitz like downs, but he's coming from 6 yards back. And in today's game, right, with just the short passes, the quarterbacks, just about everybody's getting the ball out of their hands in 3 to 4 seconds. Yeah. So it's hard to get home if the guy's coming from that far back. And I think, with Simon, right, he's much closer to the line. You can disguise things. And it's definitely been a weapon and disruptive here, especially last weekend for sure. 5
sacks by the Buckeye defense of Curtis Rourke in this game. Rourke had 18 pass attempts according to PFF. He was pressured on 11 of them. Yeah. And then I think you saw late third quarter, early fourth quarter, Indiana, I think Gus Johnson even said it. He asked Joel Klatt, is Indiana waving the white flag here? They're down 3 scores, running the football in no particular hurry. And I think Kirk Cignetti said after the game, they didn't think they could protect Rourke. So they went to running the ball. Yeah, they couldn't. So very, very impressive performance by the Buckeyes in a top 5 matchup. That's the second one that Ryan Day has under his belt this season. I'll take it. And, I don't know, from what I saw, I think Indiana's a playoff team. I thought they mostly acquitted themselves well. It was a 7-point game at the half. Buckeyes just had too much. But do you see Indiana as a playoff team?
No, and I kind of mentioned that to begin with. I think they're a pretty good team. I think we're just, they ran into a buzzsaw, right? I mean, and I think Ohio State, Oregon are the two best teams. So, yeah, I think 100% Indiana should be in the field. And I think they will be if they take care of business, right? I mean,
they very well should. I mean, they're playing the worst team in the FBS, Purdue, tomorrow. So I expect them to take care of business. Yeah, Joel Klatt said it, I thought, pretty well in the post game that, Indiana came in. It's been a great season. They do a lot of things right. But in a game of these stakes, Ohio State has been living in this rarefied air for years. I mean, they spend year-round preparing for these games. It was their third top 5 game of the season, and it was Indiana's first foray into a top 5 matchup, I think, in its program's history. So, you just kind of... You gotta get the reps in there, Indiana, I think, and before you start winning these games. But I was impressed with them, and I'd like to see them make the playoff field.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, buddy. Any other thoughts on the Indiana game?
No, let's turn the page,
okay.
so to speak.
All right, my friend. It is tomorrow, Saturday, the 120th renewal of the game. The unranked 6-5 Michigan Wolverines come to the Horseshoe for a noon Eastern kick with the good guys, the number 2 ranked 10-1 Ohio State Buckeyes. Michigan leads the all-time series between these schools 61-52 with 6 ties. The game will be broadcast on Fox. The line is now Ohio State minus 19.5. It's come down a bit. The over-under is 42.5. As we are painfully aware, PVH, the Buckeyes are currently on a 3-game losing streak in this rivalry. But this is the first time Ryan Day will be facing an unranked Michigan team in this rivalry. Now, he would have in 2020, but as we know, that game was canceled due to COVID. And this is only the second time since Day took the helm that he'll be facing a Michigan team ranked outside the top 13. That first matchup he had in 2019, Michigan was 13th in the playoff rankings. Now, his predecessor, Urban Meyer, was 7-0 against Michigan, as we know, but 3 of those wins came against unranked Michigan teams in 2013, 14, and 17. Urban Meyer benefited from 3 years of Brady Hoke to start his career at Ohio State. And Meyer's predecessor, Jim Tressel, he got 3 straight seasons of unranked Michigan in this rivalry as well between 2008 and 2010. Those were the Rich Rod years, a total disaster for Michigan. And the team Tressel beat in 2007, that was Lloyd Carr's last season, was only ranked 21st and lost 4 games that year. We've crucified Ryan Day for his record against Michigan, but he had to endure the winningest 3-year period of the Michigan program history, I think, the last 3 seasons, whereas Meyer and Tressel never saw a 3-year stretch in this rivalry that looked anything close to 2021 through 2023. So I think that's something to keep in mind as we look at this matchup. So, PVH, let's start by having a look at the strength of this Michigan squad, which, as we know, is the defense. Then we'll flip it around, have a look at the offense before we fire up the concernometer and share our score predictions. Michigan comes into this game ranked 23rd nationally in total defense after finishing number 1 in total defense a year ago. They're 29th in defensive yards per play. They're 36th in scoring defense, allowing just over 21 points per game. A year ago, Michigan led the country in scoring defense. They're 72nd nationally against the pass, allowing 222 yards per game. And that's a statistic Michigan is way, way down from last year. Michigan finished 2nd nationally against the pass. They're 72nd this year. And right now, the Michigan defense is tied for 70th nationally in touchdown passes allowed with 17. Last year, they only allowed 8 in 15 games. So they're way, way up in that statistics as well. They led the country in allowing touchdown passes a year ago. Michigan's still very good against the run, though. They're 4th nationally, allowing 94 yards per game. That's about where they were a year ago in that range. And they're still pretty good at getting after the quarterback. They're tied for 20th nationally in sacks with 31. Again, that's about the same neighborhood they were at sacks a year ago. The Michigan defense is led by, of course, defensive tackles Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. They are the best defensive tackle tandem in America. Graham and Grant are Michigan's highest graded defenders against the run, according to PFF, with grades of 91.2 and 85.1, respectively. Graham is also excellent in pass rush. He's tied for the team lead in pressures with 33. PBH, I think in Graham, you're probably looking at a top 10, maybe even a top 5 pick in April's draft. He is their best player.
And isn't the other guy, probably a first rounder as well?
Right up there. But Graham he's the creme de la creme. He's probably the best defensive tackle in the country. And I think he's their best player on either side of the ball. Now, defensive end Josiah Stewart's another player to watch. He's actually their highest graded defender, according to PFF, with an overall grade of 91.8. Stewart leads them in sacks with 8.5, and he's tied with Graham for the team lead in pressures with 33. PVH, I think Graham Grant and Stewart present a really significant challenge for the Ohio State offensive line in this game. They're probably the best trio the Buckeyes will see on the defensive line this season. Now, we're unlikely to see star cornerback Will Johnson in this game. Johnson's only appeared in 5 games for the Wolverines this season. He has not played since Michigan's October 5th loss at Washington. He's very clearly opted out, and he's getting ready for the NFL. I would assume. I'd be stunned if he played in this game. I think Pete Thamel reported last week that he was not going to play the rest of the season. So unless there's some miracle, we're not going to see Will Johnson in this game. So PVH, that's the skinny on the Michigan defense. Why don't I kick this over to you? What are you going to be watching when Ohio State has the ball against this Michigan defense?
Well, before we sort of do offense, defense, I was thinking about, right, like there's sort of 2 narratives going into this game, right? Is that, right, one, it's, hey, it's the best rivalry. Who cares about you throw out the records?
Yeah.
It's going to be a tight game. And that holds up a hell of a lot more than I think, than we would want it to. Right. Versus the other narrative, like vengeance is coming, right? It's going to be a beatdown. And the other thing that's, kind of fascinating is these last 2 games of the season are completely flipped on their head, right? Like, just think about, like, even when we did our preview pod, what were the odds that okay, so you have to pick one of the last 2 games in the shoe, and one of them is going to be a top 5 matchup. Is it Indiana or Michigan? And it turns out, lo and behold, it's Indiana. Like, okay, so then, and the other thing is, I know it's Michigan, and I know it's the biggest rivalry, blah, blah, blah. I was hyped for that Indiana game last weekend, and I think so was the team. I think so were the stands. And so I'm not 100% sure that you can throw out, hey, could there be a slight letdown for Ohio State coming into this? Because I think that Indiana game was clearly a lot bigger than anybody ever thought, coming into this season.
That's an interesting point. Although I thought it was interesting, Jack Sawyer, he's the heart and he's a spiritual leader, I think, of this team. In the post game when they interviewed him, he said, I think immediately, first words out of his mouth, no disrespect to Indiana.
I don't care.
I don't care. I want. It's about Michigan now, and I like that. The other thing, this is from Doug Maurice. This is very interesting. When Ohio State is in the top 10 and Michigan is unranked, Ohio State is 9-1. So
wow, that's interesting. I would have never. So all those Cooper years, they were usually ranked though. They just weren't quite, as good as we were, and they just stole our Halloween candy year after year. It felt like.
Yeah. It's interesting. We like to say you can throw the records out in this game, and maybe that's just because when upsets do happen, they stick in your memory for a really long period. So you think they happen more often than they do.
Yeah.
But when Ohio State is in the top 10 and Michigan is unranked, it's actually a pretty large advantage for Ohio State. Now, some of these games have been too close for comfort. I mean, we remember that 2013 game. Ohio State, that was in Ann Arbor, and they had an intercept a 2-point conversion at the goal line to preserve that win. But more often than not, when Ohio State is ranked in the top 10 and Michigan is unranked, the Buckeyes get it done.
So is vengeance coming, or are we throw out the records?
Well, I'll have something to say about that a little later in the pod. But that is a very good question. We should definitely address that. But first, why don't you give me a few thoughts, PVH, about what the Ohio State offense is going to do against this Michigan defense tomorrow?
What's the strength of their squad, right? I mean, if it's going to be a close game, right, that's how it's going to unfold, right? They're going to have some success. Dude, it's, again, I don't think the offense has even remotely scratched the surface of how good they can be. And, I wonder, has Chip and Ryan, they've been saving some stuff for this game. I usually tend to hate that narrative, like, we're not showing them anything. But Michigan's pretty damn famous for that, right? Like the screen passes to tight ends and shit like that. So, maybe there's some stuff in their bag. Again, I don't know. Do you try and just establish the run and run the ball down their throats? I don't know. That doesn't seem to be, their secondary seems to be the weak link of the defense, which, maybe you try and exploit that from the get-go and then, then start to pound it. But I just think, as good as their defense is, I just like our skill players against, what their strengths are. And I just don't know how you stop Ohio State, especially if they get clicking. I think you definitely. What's interesting is, why is Quinshon starting and Trey's not? Yeah. I know you're screaming. This is probably, I don't want to steal your thunder because you're probably going to say this, but you're going to want to see a lot of Trey. But God damn it, man, that guy has been balling out. He's healthy. This is why you brought Judkins in.
That's right.
Right, to have a healthy Trey. So I'd like to see him have a bigger, focus from a game plan perspective. And then I think this game is meant for guys like Ibuka that have been there, seen it. They're not, the moment's not going to be too big for them. And I could see him having a big game as well.
I like that. That's a good call out. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be concerned about Ohio State's patchwork offensive line without Josh Simmons and Seth McLaughlin against the Michigan defensive line. That's a clear matchup advantage for Michigan. But I mean, last week against the pretty good Indiana defensive line, right, with the Big Ten's leader in sacks, I thought the offensive line held up pretty well. They only allowed 5 pressures. They did not allow a sack. And we remember the offensive line held up reasonably well against Abdul Carter and the Penn State defensive line on the road a few weeks back. Now, I know Seth McLaughlin played in that game, and we won't have him for this one, but those performances against Indiana and Penn State give me hope that the Ohio State offensive line can draw something close to a stalemate in this matchup. I don't think they need to dominate. I don't think they will dominate up front, but if you can draw something close to a stalemate, I think that'll be enough. Now, where there is a clear advantage for Ohio State on this side of the ball, you've already mentioned it, PVH, is with the receivers against the Michigan secondary that hasn't been anything close to what it was a year ago. Again, Michigan's allowing 222 yards passing per game. That's what they allow on average. And they've allowed twice as many touchdown passes this season as compared to last. And if we look at like opponents, Texas and Oregon, right? Both of those games were played in the Big House, actually, Texas and Oregon. Quinn Ewers threw for 246 and 3 touchdown passes against Michigan. Dylan Gabriel threw for 294 and a touchdown pass. Even USC, Miller Moss threw for 283 and 3 touchdown passes against Michigan. Will Rogers of Washington threw for 271 and 2 touchdowns against them. The only one of those games Will Johnson did not play in was Oregon. So even with Will Johnson in the lineup, the Michigan secondary was getting torched. And they're going to be without him on Saturday. So I like our chances in the passing game with our skill guys and Will Howard. Howard leads the country in completion percentage at 74%. We know what Jeremiah Smith, Ibuka, Carnell Tate, that group can do. This is how I expect Chip Kelly to attack the Michigan defense. Now, to your point about Trey Henderson, I do want to dive into that a little bit. It is likely to be tough sledding in the run game against Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. Michigan also has a pair of good linebackers in Ernest Hoffsman and Jayshawn Barham. But look, again, if you look at Texas and Oregon and what they were able to do running the football against Michigan, the Longhorns ran it for 143 yards on 32 carries against Michigan. Oregon ran it for 176 on 37 carries. Now, the Ohio State offensive line right now isn't as good as those two offensive lines, but what the Buckeyes do have is a pair of backs in Henderson and Judkins that I don't think need every play to be perfectly blocked to be productive. And I do want to get to your point about Henderson. Yes, I think he gives the rushing attack the best chance to be successful in this game. He's averaging 7 yards a carry over his last 6 games. Quinshon Judkins, he's been productive, but over that same span, he's only averaging 3.9 yards per carry. And we were talking about this on the text thread last week during the game. He's still a very important player for the offense, but Judkins is just not seeing the field and reading his blocks as well as Henderson is right now. I think we can all agree on that. Henderson is averaging less than 9 carries per game this season. Coaching staff's done a great job of keeping him fresh, and I know they want to continue to do that for what we hope is a long postseason. At the same time, PVH, this is Michigan. And a Big Ten title, the number 1 overall seed in the CFP are still in Ohio State's sights. Time to take the bubble wrap off of Henderson, right? Yeah. I don't think they need to give him 25 carries on Saturday, but how about 15, right? 15, 16. So that's how I see it. Any other thoughts, PVH, on Ohio State offense against this Michigan defense?
I think we're both sort of thinking the same way on this one.
All right, buddy. Let's flip it around and have a look at the Michigan offense. From an offensive perspective, I think it's totally fair to say that Michigan's peers this season are the likes of Purdue, Stanford, Temple, and New Mexico State. Statistically, those are their peers. And Michigan comes into this game 128th nationally in total offense. They're 121st in offensive yards per play. They're 107th in scoring offense. And as a passing offense this season, Michigan has been in the service academy range. Right? They're 128th nationally in passing offense. That's only 4 spots ahead of Navy.
Who never right?
They don't even try to be good at it. Navy doesn't. So Michigan is 71st in rushing offense, and that's what they do best. They're 71st in that statistic. Now, quarterback has been quite the odyssey for the Michigan offense this season. Senior Davis Warren will lead the Wolverines into the Horseshoe on Saturday. Warren has appeared in 7 games this season, completing 64% of his passes at 5.9 yards per attempt, with 6 touchdown passes and 7 picks. Warren is one of 3 different starting quarterbacks Sherrone Moore has used this season. He began the season as a starter, as we remember, but he was benched after throwing 6 picks through their first 3 games. Then Moore turned to Alex Orji as the starter for 2 games, then to Jack Tuttle for 2 games, then back to Warren, who's been the starter for the last month. Now, Tuttle has since medically retired, and Alex Orji has only played 14 snaps during the month of November. He did not play in Michigan's win over Northwestern last week. Sorry, you going to make a comment about the quarterbacks?
No, I just the Tuttle thing.
The Tuttle, yeah.
Kind of fun.
I mean, Tuttle's claim to fame is he was Chris Olave's high school teammate. I mean, that's about the thing he'll be known for in his college career. Now, Michigan's best weapon on offense is junior tight end Colston Loveland. Loveland leads Michigan in receptions with 56, receiving yards with 582, and touchdown catches with 5. PBH, what do we like to say about offenses whose best player is a tight end?
It's rule number 3 of the TSS.
Yeah. If your best player is a tight end, you got problems. Right. But Loveland had to leave the second half of the Northwestern game last Saturday with an undisclosed injury. He did not return. His status for this game is in doubt. If he cannot play, it's hard to know where the answers will come from at receiver for Michigan in this game. After Loveland, Michigan's most productive receiver is Tyler Morris, who has 22 catches this season for 234 yards. Now, Sherrone Moore will lean heavily on running backs Khalil Mullings and Donovan Edwards in this game. There's no doubt about that. Mullings is their leader in rushing yards with 832, yards per carry at 5.4, and rushing touchdowns with 11. He was good last week against Northwestern, rushing for 7.7 yards per carry and 3 touchdowns. But he's been largely ineffective, Mullings has, largely ineffective against quality opponents this season. Only 30 yards on 10 carries against IU, only 16 yards on 8 carries against Oregon, only 25 yards on 6 carries against Texas. It's been a quiet season for Donovan Edwards, only 578 yards rushing at 4.7 yards per carry and 4 rushing touchdowns. And Edwards hasn't been nearly the factor in the passing game as he has been his first 3 seasons at Michigan. Only 16 receptions for 81 yards this season for Donovan Edwards. That's the skinny PVH on the Michigan offense. What are you going to be watching when the Buckeyes are on defense against this unit?
Well, I was thinking Bryce Underwood. And not even Kyle McCord are walking through those doors to save you, Michigan, right? Like,
no J.J. McCarthy.
No J.J. McCarthy. And the Bryce Underwood thing is actually an interesting story. We should talk about that later, the kid that's coming next year. But, yeah, you can't be that bad in quarterback. And, like Kyle McCord, I don't know why, just like you'd be so much better off with him, How did you not make a run?
Or Curtis Rourke, right?
Yeah. It's just like, what? Whatever. So if I'm Michigan, right, what you got one chance here. And in today's game, it's actually, you can do it, is you shorten the game as much as possible and limit Ohio State's offensive touches, possessions. And they're just going to try and run the ball. Yep. And they're just going to keep doing it and hopefully have enough success to get this into the fourth quarter where it's within a score or 2 and you have a shot. I mean, that's got to be the mindset. That's got to be the game plan.
No doubt.
And so if you're Jim Knowles, right, I mean, how much do you stack the box and just try and take that away from them? And then they're going to try and go up over the top and, get some ticky-tack INTs from our boy Iggy and see if they can, move the ball. But other than that, like if that doesn't work, I just don't see how they can even remotely be effective against our defense.
I'm with you. Missed tackles, blown coverages, and penalties are the only hope I think Michigan has at moving the football in this game. Now, the last time these two teams played in the Horseshoe in 2022, that's exactly what Ohio State gave them. Missed tackles, blown coverages, and penalties. And that allowed Michigan to run away with the game as they did. But, as we talked about, this is a very different Michigan team. No J.J. McCarthy. The Ohio State defense has been in the single digits the last 2 weeks in missed tackles. Only 7 against Indiana, only 8 against Northwestern. Funny enough, they had 15 against Purdue. But against Penn State, they only had 4. Keep up the good tackling against Mullings and Edwards. And Michigan, as you said, look, they're going to try and play ball control. They're going to pound the ball in the run game, and they're going to hope for some missed tackles at the second level. Now, we've been very critical of Davison Igbinosun and Denzel Burke in coverage this season, but I tell you what, this is a matchup where their ability to tackle well is extremely valuable. Igbinosun and Burke have the defense's highest PFF tackling grades this season. They're both grading well over 80 in tackling, and this is a very different secondary from the one Michigan faced just a year ago. Lathan Ransom was injured and did not play in that game, as we remember, and of course Caleb Downs was not a part of that secondary either. Earlier this week, by the way, Downs was named a finalist for 3 major awards, the Thorpe, Bednarik, and Lott Impact Trophy. I think he's going to have a big role in this game. That secondary is what makes me feel good about what we're almost certain Michigan's strategy is going to be, right? Pound the ball, hope to make a play or two at the second level on a missed tackle. I think it's going to be very tough to do against the Ohio State secondary. Just they're so good at tackling and making plays back there. And we talked about this at the top. Since the Oregon game, Jim Knowles has figured out a good, balanced approach to pressuring the quarterback. Cody Simon has become a real weapon for Knowles as a blitzer from the second level. Doug Lesmerises is saying that Simon and Knowles kind of share a brain. Like there's this mind meld between the two. Simon is an extension of Knowles on the field, and they're just in sync. And, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to pressure Davis Warren and create real havoc on passing downs. Like if you can get him off his first read, it is trouble for Michigan. And I think they can pressure him and force him into mistakes. And this is another area where the Ohio State defense has vastly improved from the last 3 times Michigan has faced them. So if Ohio State, continues the trend of tackling well, limiting big plays, which they've done all year, and limiting mistakes, it's really hard to imagine the Michigan offense doing much of anything in this game.
Yeah. Well, and, to linebackers, I don't think we've said his name once this entire season, but I would have to think some credit should go to James Laurinaitis for having the linebackers playing at the level that they're playing at,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, obviously Knowles, but Simon, God, they've been phenomenal as opposed to years past. We're just like, you could put my dog Maggie as the linebackers coach and get more production out of our linebackers. So Laurinaitis, and what a shocker, right? Like take an alum, an all-pro, right? I bet he might actually, bring something to the defense. So
much more impactful as a full-time assistant coach than a GA like he was last year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I agree. And Sonny Styles too is starting to look more and more comfortable at linebacker. We forget this is his first season of playing linebacker. And he struggled earlier in the season, but he looks more and more comfortable with every snap at linebacker too. He's played very well for them.
Totally.
PVH, anything else you want to say about this side of the ball before we fire up the concernometer?
Yeah, I think let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, buddy. Get us started. What is your concernometer readout for this game?
So, it's Michigan, right? So you're going to move there is no zero floor for the concernometer. So
I agree.
I think you start at 3, right? Mm-hmm. And so that being said, and again, I go back to like if this were flip-flopped, right? In Indiana, you wouldn't be worried about this team other than the fact that it's Michigan. So I would normally be at a 4.5, but with the floor at 3, I'm at 7.5.
Wow, 7.5. All right. Well, this is very interesting. Second week in a row, I'm at a 5. Well, and that level of concern is mostly around the offensive line handling what I think is the best defensive front they will have seen so far this season. I've already made it clear that matchup concerns me, even though the Buckeyes have the advantage everywhere else. It's also senior day. It's quite possibly the last game the 2021 senior class will play in the shoe that we have to remember. It is within the realm of possibility they could play a playoff game in the Horseshoe. And it's Michigan, right? This game is different, as you've already pointed out, PVH. It's even when they're not that good, there's just so much wrapped up in this game for this coaching staff and this collection of seniors coming off of 3 consecutive dream-killing losses to this school. So I'm at a 5, but surprisingly, not anywhere close to your readout. Well, neither is Chad, by the way. Chad, he's coming in at a 5.5 on his Concernometer readout.
Right, so we flipped the script here. When's the last time that he and I are both higher comms than you? This is, and it might be a good sign.
I think so. Know. We gotta break some trends here for Ohio State to break through and get a win. Right? We're doing our preview pod the Friday before instead of Wednesday, and you and Chad are higher on the Concernometer than me. So I think we're doing our job to break
and you're
tendencies.
Also the guy 5 years ago that was like, this rivalry is dead.
You're never going to let me forget that. I'm never going to live that down. Okay, my friend, let's get to some score predictions. PVH, get us started. What do you got?
So I've been all over the map on this, and even as we've been doing this pod, I think I've 5 different score predictions. Even though my Concernometer's 7.5, I still think we win it, just not dominate them. So I've got it 31-13.
31-13. Okay, I like it. Before I give you mine, let me give you CP's. CP, very confident. He's got Ohio State 47, Michigan 13. Wow.
That's a lot of points.
I'd love to see that. I hope he's right about that, because then I'd be kicking up my feet and just enjoying the game and not sweating bullets. Right? I mean, I'm going to try not to overreact when Michigan moves the ball on their first drive. The Ohio State offense only has one possession and the score is 7-3 going into the second quarter, because that's pretty much what's happened in every game this season for Ohio State except for one. In PVH, these are the scores after one quarter of play in Ohio State's last 5 games. 7-0, 10-7, 7-0, 0-0, 7-0. Wow. And the only game this year where Ohio State had a double-digit lead going into the second quarter was Western Michigan. They led 21-0 going into the second quarter. Otherwise, all of the scores heading into the second quarter look pretty much like what they have the last 5 weeks. The Ohio State-Michigan offenses rank 114th and 121st respectively in plays per game. Both offenses move at a very slow, deliberate pace, and on top of that, you have a running game clock. And on top of that, you have 2 very talented defenses that will be tough to move the ball on. So it's likely to take a minute for the Buckeyes to get control of this game. That's how it's gone all season, and there's no reason to think that trend won't continue in this game. So having said all that, PVH, will you remind me that I said all that tomorrow during the first quarter when I'm fucking freaking out?
I mean, the apoplecticness of Juan with that first Indiana drive last weekend was, I mean, I should have videotaped it. It was a sight to see, man. Like, dude, it's just the first drive.
It's just the first drive, totally, man. And I'm certainly much more like Juan emotionally when it comes to, the first quarter of these games. Now, I have huge respect for the Michigan front seven. They will keep Michigan in this game for a while. But I think that unit's going to spend a lot of time on the field in this game. And they don't have the depth on defense they did a year ago. I think Ohio State wears them down in the second half and breaks it open for a 31-9 victory. Nice. You and I are pretty close in our score predictions, PVH. I think the seniors lead the way. JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, Cody Simon, Emeka Egbuka, Donovan Jackson, Trey Henderson, and of course, Will Howard. Caleb Downs, who is only a sophomore, as we know, but plays like a senior, is also going to have a big role tomorrow afternoon. Then it's onward and upward to a rematch with Oregon next Saturday in Indy for the Big Ten title, PVH. Okay, buddy, that was a fine effort for a Black Friday morning. Why don't we end things there for our listeners? Check your feeds for a recap of the Michigan game on Sunday afternoon. Until then, thanks so much for listening. Go Bucks. Michigan sucks. You've been listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.